Have you ever seen how a friend or a celebrity you're following tweeted something that was obviously a scam and wondered what gotten into them? Something like US President Joe Biden asking his followers to send Bitcoin to a random address? In moments like these, we can be almost 100% certain that they didn't tweet that themselves. But how did this tweet then end up on their profile? Well, the probability is high that they were the victim of a so-called clickjacking attack. But what exactly is clickjacking? In this video, you'll learn what clickjacking is and how it works and what different types of clickjacking attacks there are. I will also provide some countermeasures you can use to secure yourself from being vulnerable to this kind of attack. What is clickjacking? Clickjacking is a type of web attacks and it's also known as UI redress attack. This term describes a type of attack in which the attacker tricks their victims into performing an action within a user interface element which they are unable to see. This is usually done by adding another invisible and malicious layer of user interface elements on top of a normal one. This way, a user that wants to perform an action whose elements are layered behind such a malicious element, unbeknownst clicks on the invisible element. There are different ways clickjacking can be performed. Often, web users encounter this type of trap when they browse websites that are covered in ads. For example, a legally questionable streaming website. In this case, the malicious HTML element is layered on top of the Close Ad button. If the user wants to click this button to get rid of the ad, they perform an action that is hidden on top of that instead. Other times, the attack is a bit more advanced and uses the content of a different legitimate website to trick users into clicking on the malicious content. In this case, they create their own website, ideally with a URL that is very similar to the original one, and load the content of the original page inside an iframe HTML element. Then, they overlap this iframe with their own malicious web content. If a user then ends up on this page instead of the legit one and wants to perform any of the provided actions, they then click on the malicious invisible frame instead. Depending on the functionality the attacker had implemented in the hidden element, there are different types of clickjacking attack and different ways to exploit a clickjacking attack. The next part of this video will cover the most common ones. As mentioned before, one of the most common ways to perform a clickjacking attack is by hiding the target element. With a few simple CSS attributes, it is very easy for attackers to layer hidden malicious elements in front of seemingly legit elements a user has real interest in interacting with. For example, a Close Ad button. On top of that button, the attacker then adds an element that triggers the malicious action when clicked. It is incredibly easy to hide such an element, for example by wrapping it in a div container with a higher z-index. Then the element that is layered below, also setting the CSS opacity value to 0. Without any further investigation, no normal user should be able to realize that there is another element besides the one they can see on the page. Besides completely overlapping the decoy elements, attackers might also be able to confuse their victims by covering only a part of the target element. Let's say, for example, the attacker wants to get the victim to send them money via PayPal. In this case, they could use the PayPal checkout iframe and only cover the parts of the frame that contain the information about the amount of money to be sent as well as the recipient. Since the pay button is not covered with another element, it is still intact and the victim might think they are sending a much smaller amount of money to another person. A similar result can be generated by performing a so-called cursor jacking or cursor spoofing attack. In this case, the attacker creates a fake cursor the victim immediately mistakes for their own cursor. This fake cursor is then indicated to point to a seemingly legit button, for example, a suddenly appearing loud video that the user wants to pause, as may be very annoying. Meanwhile, the victim's real cursor is hidden by using the CSS cursor property and setting it to none. It is then made to click on a different element, which is hidden somewhere on the page. This element then might trigger any sort of malicious actions. The last type of clickjacking attack I want to talk about in this video is exploiting a human's reaction time. The usual reaction time regarding visual changes of a human takes about a few hundred milliseconds. Attackers can use this by quickly moving the malicious content right where they know a victim will click next. You may have seen those mini-games on slightly sketchy websites where you're supposed to click on certain elements as fast as you can. Alternatively, attackers use a button that says double click here to trick people into performing multiple clicks at the same location. In this case, the malicious element will appear immediately after the victim's first click, and because of the relatively slow reaction time, the victim will probably click on the malicious element before registering that it's even there. So we now know how a clickjacking attack works. But what kind of malicious functions are usually hidden within those malicious elements? To be fair, attackers could do almost anything their imagination allows them to. But let's cover some of the most common ways clickjacking attacks can be used. The first thing I want to cover is called likejacking. With this, the victim gets tricked into liking social media posts like on Facebook or Instagram. To do this, they use a hidden element that points to any page that contains a like button, for example for an Instagram post. Of course, this element is invisible, and if the victim tries to click the button below this element, they then involuntarily trigger the function to like the connection. Next to likejacking, the other kind of clickjacking attack that is very widespread is called tweet bombing. This works similar to likejacking, but instead of liking another person's tweet or Instagram picture, the victim automatically involuntarily sets off a tweet on their own user account. Most of the time, those tweets contain a link that takes other users to malicious websites. Another way this can be exploited is the way I mentioned in the introduction of this video, where a rather known person sends out tweets asking for a money transfer via Bitcoin, for example. Besides those widespread ways to use a clickjacking attack, of course there are many more. By using cursor jacking or any type of hidden elements, attackers might trick victims into clicking on a button that allows the host of the website access to the camera or microphone of the user. Resulting in this, the attacker can easily invade the privacy of the victim and start spying on them. Something that triggers the download of files or different types of software, including malware, or functions that work as a cross-site request forgery attack, in which the victim triggers a request, for example, for a money transfer. So, now that we know how a clickjacking attack can work and what it can be used for, it's time for me to show you how an attacker would set up an attack like this, so you can get a better understanding of the theory of a clickjacking attack. So let's head into the demo part now. Alright, welcome to the demo part of this video. For this demo I'm using the Portswigger Web Security Academy lab. Those labs are deliberately insecure websites provided to practice web security attacks on a legal basis. If you want to check it out yourself, I will put a link in the description of this video that will take you to the clickjacking labs on the page. So for this demo, we want to trick another user of this website into deleting their account. If we head over to the My Account page, we can see that right below the option to change the connected email address is a button that allows a user to delete their account. So what we're going to do now is set up a website that embeds this exact page here. To do this, the lab provides an additional exploit server that we can use to set up the malicious page. For this, we'll be using the following code down here. First, we load the My Account page within the iframe element, and then we create a div that simply says test me, as we first need to align it perfectly so the div is right below the delete account button. You can see here that the opacity of the iframe is set to 0.1 right now, as we still need to see it to align everything. Also, you can see that the z-index attribute of the iframe element is 2, so it's higher than the z element of the div element, as we want the real website layered above our decoy. Now we can store our exploit code, and then we can click on View Exploit to see if everything matches. Unfortunately, our decoy div is still too high, as it's here and we want it here above the delete account button. So we have to fix that. So we just go back. So I just changed the top position of the div from 300 to, let's say, maybe 500. And while we're at it, I also changed the Test Me banner to Click Me to make it more tempting to click. And now we can check the page again by storing it first and click on View Exploit. And now we can see that it's perfectly overlapping with the Delete Account button. And if we hover over the Click Me, we also get a different pointer because that is generated by the Delete Account button below. So this actually looks like a real button. So now we go back, and the last step we're going to do is just set the opacity to 0 to make it invisible. And now we can store it again and reload the exploit again. And now on this page we can see that there's only the Click Me visible. And in the last step we can now deliver this page to our victim and hope that they actually click on the banner that says Click Me. So we're just going to click Deliver Exploit to Victim. And as you can see, the lab immediately gives us feedback that the exploit worked and that we solved the lab. So I hope this demo helped you understand the theory of a clickjacking attack a bit better. And now let's get back to the video, as you probably wonder what measures can be taken to avoid your website being misused for a clickjacking attack like this. Previously, I mentioned that clickjacking can occur on sketchy websites you might be visiting because you want to stream the latest episode of your favorite show that is not yet available on Netflix. But as I also mentioned, oftentimes the attackers misuse other legitimate websites by including them in an iframe, so that their malicious site also seems legit to the victim. If you want to avoid that your website is also used for that, there are some measures you can implement that should prevent that from happening. The first countermeasure that can be initiated to defend your website from being misused for a clickjacking attack is using the X-Frame options HTTP response header. You can use this header to set different option values that decide whether your page is allowed to be rendered in an iframe HTML element. There are different values that can be set depending on how strict you want this defense to be. You can choose between deny, same origin, or allow from URI. This way, you can ensure that your page won't be embedded in a clickjacking page and avoid it being misused. Alternatively to the X-Frame options, you can also use the Content Security Policy Frame Ancestors directive. This directive can also be used the same way as the X-Frame options, but is unfortunately not supported by all browsers yet. But if you want to list a few sites that are legit and allowed to embed your pages, that is possible when using frame ancestors. For this, you can choose between the values none or self, and you can list a certain site, including the protocol, if you want a certain website being able to embed your page, but only using HTTPS, for example. Next, to avoid any cross-site request forgery vulnerabilities to additionally appear, make sure you prevent that the session cookie of a user is being included when a page is loaded in a new frame. You can do this by using the same site cookie attribute. If you want to learn more about CSRF and how it can be prevented, I put a link in the description of this video that takes you to my video on that topic. Last, you might also want to use a frame killing script if you want your application being also protected in older browsers that don't support X-Frame or frame ancestors. This is done by including a JavaScript code snippet in your pages that ensure that those pages can't be embedded within iframes on other websites. An example for such a code snippet could look like this. Also, to protect yourself becoming a victim of a clickjacking attack, besides from simply being cautious while browsing, you can also add another layer of security here. To do this, you can use a browser extension that scans a website for any clickjacking attempts and hidden elements and warns you in case it finds one. An example for that would be NoClickJack for Firefox and Chrome, and I will put a link to the extension in the description of this video. Now, to put everything together, I hope after watching this video you have a better understanding on what a clickjacking attack is and how you can protect yourself and your web application to be vulnerable to clickjacking. Always make sure that you're including some type of measures that prevent your page from being embedded in foreign iframes, like using X-Frame options or the Frame Ancestors directive. Also, if you're browsing yourself, Be aware that clickjacking is a web security risk that is still around, and try to avoid mindlessly clicking when visiting the web. You will find all the links to the resources and websites I mentioned in this video in the description. If you're interested in learning more about web security, consider subscribing to my channel so you don't miss out on any new uploads, and feel free to check out my other videos. Also, if you found this video helpful, please leave a like. Until then, I wish you a delightful day and see you soon in the next video. Goodbye.